Okay, dear audience, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Hope you all are well, and I am also fine. So, welcome to Amader Pathshala. It is one of the most and important platform to continuing the multimedia class into the Mohona TV. So, it's presented by Manipur Viswavidyalaya and College, Mirpur, Dhaka. Our today's lessons are from the HSC level students, chapter 2nd, subject biology, and we start from the chapter human physiology, breathing and respiration from chapter 5. The breathing and respiration, it is one of the necessary part into any organism. So there are some learning outcome. At the end of this lesson, you will be able to know, to tell what is lung, describe the hemoglobin, and analyze the transportation process by respiratory pigment. So, we can see the major respiratory organ that is called the lungs. So, what is the lungs? Lungs, one of the organ that helps not only the oxygen but also the carbon dioxide in your body, and also helps to purify the blood. That means when oxygen enter into the lungs, at a time some molecule of carbon dioxide released from the lungs into the environment. That means there are interrelationship between the oxygen and outer the carbon dioxide. So it is a mechanism process. So all dear students, already you know that our lungs, the pumping organ. What is the pumping organ? It is pumping organ of the gaseous system, oxygen and carbon dioxide. And it's included the oxygen into the blood and absorb the carbon dioxide from the blood. As a result, the blood purified by adding oxygen and carbon dioxide released into the blood, that means from our body into the environment. So it is a mechanism that is held all over all the organism of the plants and animals. So firstly, we can see and learn some definition. Number 1 point, what is respiration? Respiration is a process, that means it is the metabolic reactions process. What is the metabolic reaction process? The whole internal chemical reaction, external or internal, which is occurred into our body, that is commonly called the metabolic reaction. And process that take place in the cells of organism, that means it is take place into the cell. That means cell is one of the important organ that is absorb the oxygen and release the carbon dioxide. As a result, we can take energy and absorb the energy and uses the energy. So finally, we can get our works. That means our works done by the respiration process. So main theme is, if we can realize any energy, the energy always comes from the mechanism. It's called the respiration. So what is the energy? It is called the kinetic energy. That means to convert kinetic energy from the nutrients into the potential energy. That means we always reserve the potential energy. That is called the ATP, adenosine triphosphate. Adenosine triphosphate always is reserved of the chemical energy as a chemical compound, and we uses the energy. Finally, we can get the kinetic energy. So it is the potential energy, it is the kinetic energy. Which energy is reserved into our body? It is called the potential energy. And which energy released, that means which energy used into our body, it's called the kinetic energy. Okay, all dear students. In the presence of different enzymes, so when chemical reactions takes place into our body, it held into some the different presence of the some different enzymes and absence or oxygen. That means respiration is a process that is the metabolic reaction process that is helps into our cell on the presence of the different enzymes or presence of oxygens or absent of oxygens, and as a result the potential energy converted into the kinetic energy. So next definition is external respiration. That means respiration has two types. One is external respiration, or last one is internal respiration. So external respiration, they are held into the only lungs and the environment. Lungs and environment. That means only exchange the oxygen and carbon dioxide. So oxygen enter into our lungs and carbon dioxide released from the lungs. That is called the external respiration. If we call the internal respiration, it is one of the respiration that is held by the help of external respiration. That means when oxygen enter into our lungs, that is attached into the blood and finally circulate into our body and reach to the cell. And cell use this oxygen and produce the carbon dioxide, and that is finally circulate and enter into the lungs and release into the environment. It is called the internal respiration. So if we imagine our metabolic energy, so internal respiration helps to produce the energy. So we can get the energy into our body by the internal respiration. So dear students, the mechanism process is a complex materials, but it is easily described for understand. And some are definition, respiratory gases. Respiration gases are oxygen and carbon dioxide. That means one is the oxygen, other is the carbon dioxide. So they are the respiratory gases. The respiratory pigment, although we learn the gaseous exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide. So when oxygen carries into the cell and produces the carbon dioxide into the cell and carries into the lungs. So what the materials carries the oxygen and carbon dioxide? Its name is the hemoglobin, but respiratory pigment. So the other name of the hemoglobin is the respiratory pigment that is helps to carry the oxygen and carbon dioxide into our body. Other is a process that is called the diffusion. So it is the transport the non-polar molecule from the higher density to lower density. So the diffusion is a process that is helps to the transport any materials from the higher density to lower density. That means it is a membrane. If we imagine it is the higher density, so it is the lower density. So when the materials flow from the higher density to lower density, it is called the diffusion. Now we can see a process transportation system by the lungs into our body. Firstly, we can see the process. The oxygen enter into the lungs and carbon dioxide released from the lungs. The lungs composed of some and million alveolus. So alveolus or alveoli is the main materials that is helps to exchange the oxygen carbon dioxide. So about 300 million alveoli composed into the lungs. It is the mechanism oxygen enter into the blood vessel and comes out from the blood vessel into our body. So it is our diffusion process. How can the mechanism is completed? So now we discuss about the transportation system of gases that is called the oxygen and carbon dioxide. Already we know that it is called the alveolus in the previous slide, and it is called the alveolar duct, and the web-like structure that is covered by the alveolus that is called the blood vessels. We known about the blood vessel. There are three types of the blood vessel. It's called the number one artery, number two vein, number three blood capillaries. So it is one of the intersection of alveolus, and it is called the blood vessel. That means blood capillaries. If it is a artery, it is branch into the blood capillaries, then it forms the vein. So it is called the artery. It is the blood capillaries. And it is one of the vein. So they are the blood capillaries. That means this is the one of the part that is help the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide. So if we imagine that it is one of the cell, oxygen enter into the cell and produces the carbon dioxide, that is helps to the circulate into our body. So it is oxygen, it is carbon dioxide. So oxygen always enter the cell from the blood, and carbon dioxide always enter into the blood capillaries. So how do the circulate into our body? That is called the transportation mechanism. Alveolus is the structural and functional unit of the lungs. It is very tiny bubble-like air sacs, which is the gas exchange surface, that is called the alveolus. Respiratory pigment. Already we know the circulation system of oxygen and carbon dioxide. Which materials or components transport the oxygen and carbon dioxide? That is called the respiratory pigment. The main respiratory pigment named is the hemoglobin. That is called the hemoglobin. It contains the red blood corpuscle. That means red blood corpuscle contain the hemoglobin, and hemoglobin as like as structure, it is composed of the heme and globin protein. Heme and globin protein. That means it is one of the internal structure of the hemoglobin. Hemoglobin contains 95% globin and about 5% heme. It is one of the ironous materials and it is one of the protein material. So hemoglobin contains the protein and iron. The hemoglobin present in the human blood is the respiratory pigment. It plays an important role in respiration. That means hemoglobin, one of the main respiratory pigment, that is the helps to exchange the oxygen and carbon dioxide. Role of respiratory pigment into our body. Firstly, we know about the transportation of oxygen. How mechanism oxygen can circulate into our body. Firstly, the lungs take the oxygen. Firstly, lungs take the oxygen from the environment. And secondly, it's transport into our body. And thirdly, it reacts with hemoglobin and produces a molecule named oxyhemoglobin. That means HB, one of the short form of the hemoglobin. The reaction mechanisms are hemoglobin plus oxygen react each other and produces the oxyhemoglobin. Oxyhemoglobin. And when oxyhemoglobin formed into our body, it transported by the blood into the cell. That means it is transported into the cell, and cell only absorb the oxygen. Cell only absorb the oxygen. That mechanisms are oxyhemoglobin. If we imagine it is one of the lungs into our body, firstly oxygen enter into our lungs, after that it is enter into the blood vessel which contains the hemoglobin and attached to the hemoglobin and produces the oxyhemoglobin. And it is circulated into our body and cell absorb the oxygen. At a time, the cell release the carbon dioxide. So it is one of the hub mechanism transport the gaseous materials, that is the oxygen. The other one is the transportation of the carbon dioxide. So it is the complex reaction, then the oxyhemoglobin. So one part of the carbon dioxide enter into the red blood cell directly. That means it is enter into the hemoglobin. Enter into the hemoglobin, it produces of the cell. That means firstly cell absorb the oxygen and it uses and produces as a waste substance, that is called the carbon dioxide. And carbon dioxide carries into our lungs with the attach of the hemoglobin. So, and combines with the amino group of the hemoglobin and is carried as a carbaminohemoglobin. And is combined with the amino group of the hemoglobin and carries as a carbamino hemoglobin into our lungs. The mechanisms are carbon dioxide react with the hemoglobin. That means carbaminohemoglobin. Carbamino, what is it's called the carbaminohemoglobin? Because hemoglobin, there are the 3 or 4 parts. One of the major components is the amino group. Amino group always attaches the hemoglobin and produces the carbaminohemoglobin. And carbaminohemoglobin attaches with the carbon dioxide and produces the carbaminohemoglobin group with the reaction with carbon dioxide. That mechanisms are carbon dioxide attached with the hemoglobin. That means carbaminohemoglobin. And finally, when produces the carbaminohemino group of the hemoglobin, and finally it's enter into the blood vessel. And it transport into the lungs as a carbaminohemino group, and when it's enter into the lungs, the alveolus absorb the carbon dioxide. That means alveolus absorb the carbon dioxide. That means carbon dioxide enter into the lungs, and finally it released from the lungs into the environment. So, dear students, the mechanism process of exchange oxygen and carbon dioxide and some complex metabolic reaction held into our body, that means internal respiration. So, if we remember about the first learning materials, that is called the external respiration and internal respiration, we can divide it into the 2 parts. One is, it is called the external respiration, and it is the internal respiration. Okay, the figure shows external and internal respiration elaborately, and how can the internal respiration held into our body with the complex mechanism with metabolic reaction, and how the external respiration held into our body. So, there are no chemical reaction into the external respiration. Remind that there are no chemical reaction into the lungs, that is called the external respiration. Only all chemical reaction, that means only the respiratory system materials, mechanism, the internal, the all chemical or metabolic reaction about the respiration, it is held only the internal body, that is called the internal respiration. Evaluation of this chapter. There are some questions and some solution. Number 1, what is lungs? Lungs is the main respiratory organ into our body. Number 2, what do you mean by co-redship reaction? That means when oxygen enter into the red blood corpuscle, that means hemoglobin and carbon dioxide release, there has a imbalance into the reaction. When we try to the balanced is the sodium ion and potassium ion helps to the balance the element enter the red blood corpuscle and the element outer the red blood corpuscles. So the balanced mechanism always held by the sodium and potassium ion. So it is called the courtship reaction. As much as hemoglobin released from the red blood corpuscle, as much as sodium ion balanced that. And when chlorine imbalance into our body, the potassium ion balanced that. It is called the courtship reaction. The role of the respiratory pigment, transport the oxygen and carbon dioxide into our body. And other is the hemoglobin plays as an important role in the transportation of gases in the body. It is the analysis. That means the whole mechanism express the transportation of gases by the hemoglobin. Okay? So, all dear students, there are one of the homework for you. The homework is transportation of oxygen and carbon dioxide gas by the respiratory pigment. So dear students, thank you so much. Thank you so much participating in this class. Keep well. Allah Hafiz.